A dilemma rests at the centre of the trans ideology regarding how gender is expressed. For many trans activists, gender comes in two distinct categories. The first being gender identity, which refers to a subjective definition of what one takes their gender to be, given the gender identities available to them, while gender expression refers to how an individual presents their gender through their actions, clothes, demeanour, and so on, and how those presentations are viewed based on social expectations. For many trans activists, we must demolish the oppressive and patriarchal gender stereotypes we expect men and women to follow, and instead open up the gender roles to enable men, women, and everyone to behave in ways that are congruent with their own authentic gender identity. As the philosopher and trans activist Judith Butler remarks, gender is what gender does. As I argued in my video, will self-ID be the end of gender? If the concept of gender refers to no particular way of living, and if there is no meaningful distinction between the genders, then the concept of gender no longer exists, leading to what is sometimes called gender abolition. Surely this is a wonderful thing. No more will women be expected to be carers, to sacrifice their careers for their children. No more will men be expected to work the dirty and dangerous jobs, or to parent their children primarily through their money and not their time. What a stunning victory this is for gender relations and the emancipation of the individual to live according to their most authentic self. The glass ceiling has been shattered, the shackles loosened, and aspirations lifted. Right? Not so fast. As the author and gender critical activist Helen Joyce notes in her book Trans, LGBT groups couch their teaching materials in hopelessly restrictive gender norms. In 2018, a British teacher recorded a training session on gender conducted by Mermaids, a British charity that campaigns for early paediatric transitioning. The group's favoured teaching aid is a gender spectrum, with Barbie at one end and G.I. Joe at the other, with Jelly Baby outline figures in between, morphing from curly and cutesy to broad-shouldered and stocky. Where one falls on the scale will determine how they live, and if they fall on the more female end of the spectrum, they may take on a female name and dress and behave in stereotypically female ways. In another example, Helen Joyce mentions All of Us, a course for 12 and 13-year-olds, which is a module in which children list behaviours typical of boys and girls. For boys, the lesson plan gives examples such as building things, liking action films, and playing with toy cars. And for girls, it lists cooking, dancing, shopping, and wearing makeup. Now, you might be expecting a grand reveal that actually boys and girls can do and like anything that they want, and that these gender stereotypes have been passed down by patriarchal social structures and so on. But instead, they are told that a trans person is one whose sex does not match their gender identity, and are shown a video of Nevo, a trans boy who is undergoing a medical and social transition to make his appearance more masculine and to better reflect how he feels inside. Rather than dismantling gender stereotypes, the LGBT movement has asserted that gender is expressed through them, and that if one does not conform to these rigid stereotypes, something is wrong with them, and the only way to feel better is to live according to their true, authentic gender role. This is beginning to look like a cynical attempt to imbue gender confusion and discomfort among naive children, and to reinforce the idea that gender is actually delineated according to a strict set of societal rules and expectations. But you might be wondering, why? What is the point in all of this? Surely we should just smash gender stereotypes and move on with our lives. No, because if gender is not expressed through stereotypes, then there is nothing to transition from or transition to. The entire practice of socially and medically transitioning would collapse. The concept of being born in the wrong body and having a male or female sex soul would vanish. Instead, a number of LGBT groups want to instill the sense of discomfort that comes from the idea that we are not conforming to our gender. This is the motivation to adopt the whole ideology and to begin transitioning. Research conducted by Paul Vasey, a Canadian psychology professor who studies homosexual males in non-Western contexts, suggests that whether highly feminine men grow up to identify as gay men or trans women is largely determined by their culture. In a study of highly feminine males in Samoa, known locally as Fa'afafine, Paul Vasey conducted a series of interviews to gauge Samoan society's attitudes to cross-gender identification, atypical sexual characteristics, and to what extent parental encouragement or the lack of influenced feelings of distress regarding the previously mentioned attitudes. Paul Vasey found that Fa'afafine were much more engaged in typical female behaviours than men, and spent significantly more time playing with girls' toys and games, taking girls' roles in house, putting on makeup, wearing girls' clothes, and doing girls' chores. Paul Vasey remarked that the Fa'afafine we interviewed did not recall distress as a direct result of their cross-gender behaviours and cross-gender identities. Rather, they often cited these behaviours and feelings as the sources of intense personal joy. The research team ultimately concluded that the Fa'afafine data raised the question as to whether gender dysphoria causes distress and, as such, whether gender dysphoria is a mental disorder. In keeping with the DSM's guidelines, we have argued that only distress that is in the individual and directly caused by gender dysphoria should be taken as indicative of a mental disorder. This interpretation is consistent with the DSM's own criteria that a mental disorder must not merely reflect a conflict between the individual and society. In Western cultures, the diagnosis of gender variant children with gender dysphoria would seem to be a prime example of a conflict between the individual and the society in which he or she lives. In such instances, the child deviates from culturally prescribed gender roles and expectations, and the society, in turn, seeks to police those gender role expectations by labelling the child with a mental disorder and then treating the child to eliminate the deviant behaviours. In other words, if society doesn't strictly police gender roles, there is no distress, and if there is no distress, there is no need to transition. And that is why trans activists are so keen to hold on to outdated gender stereotypes, because without them, the whole house of cards tumbles and the concept of transitioning from one gender to another ceases to exist. Live your life without the need to fit into a pigeonhole. No surgery or attempt to socially transition from one caricatured way of living to another will make you feel complete. Live flexibly in your biological identity, and just maybe we don't have to medicalise children from cradle to grave or plunge society into bitter and esoteric debates that benefit no one but embattled Twitter activists.